welcome to Dolfin's offices. It is rather warm outside and unfortunately rather warm inside. Hopefully we can try and get that cool down a degree or two. My name's Simon Black. I run the investment portfolios here at Dolfin. I was asked just to give a couple of minutes on our perspective on where we are with Brexit before I pass on to much more learned people to discuss the outlook and the situation. From our perspective, we're dealing with clients all over the world. We have a lot of questions from them in terms of investment opportunities, our investment process, how we're going to invest their portfolio. But currently the number one question, as it has been for the last few months, is what's going on with Brexit? A lot of our clients are not English and they're looking at the process that we've been going through for now a little over 3 years, and with Boris chosen and elected yesterday to something that he's promising that he's going to deliver in a little over 3 months. So understandably, there's some skepticism from our clients, but also a curiousness in terms of what is this Brexit? Why is it so complicated to deal with and to process through? And also when you're dealing with clients from many different countries, the concept of what's this country island that's split in two and why is this causing so much of an issue? From our side, we're running two sets of portfolios, one where we're looking at the global side, one where we're running some investor visa, where we are forced to invest into UK equities. And we've had to take two very, very different approaches. On the UK side, one of the amazing things about the FTSE 100 is it's filled with some of the best companies in the world who have listed and are traded through London, which means that even though we're restricted to UK companies, actually we have the choice and chance to invest in a large number of very, very global companies. So we've managed to construct, I wouldn't call it a Brexit-proof portfolio because I think we're still waiting to see how this is going to be resolved, but something that from our side makes sense to a lot of our clients from the construction perspective. It's more on the global international side that we've struggled a little more because we're in a comparative world. When we're looking at investment opportunities, something that clients want is certainty. Not certainty of returns, but certainty of the environment that they're investing into. One of the issues that we have seen is a little bit of uncertainty when it comes to the UK, uncertainty as to how Brexit is going to look. And sort of to echo Theresa May's Brexit is Brexit, our sort of response to that, well, is it really? How is it going to look? How is it going to be deployed? What are the restrictions going to be for investors and clients of ours? I'm not going to prattle on anymore. I'm going to hand over to Roger Sanders, who's going to talk us through and take us through and guide us through this morning. And I'm very much looking forward to it. Thank you very much for coming.
Well, good morning, everyone, and it's lovely to see you all here. Thank you for making the effort for an early start. We've got a pretty full house. Just a few house rules. We're going to have opening statements from our attendees this morning, and then open it up for a panel discussion, and then with questions from the floor. The timing of this breakfast meeting couldn't be better in terms of what's happened in the last 24 hours. We have a new leader of the Liberal Democrat Party, Joe Swinson. We also have a new leader and Prime Minister later today for the Conservatives. 31st of October is the date that everyone is talking about. Is that, as it's Halloween, is it really going to be a trick or a treat, is the question. So what we're hoping today is that we'll have some answers, some clarity, fingers crossed. To what extent is the UK financial services sector and industry prepared for a no-deal Brexit? Is there a choice between no deal and the withdrawal agreement that's currently been placed unsuccessfully before Parliament on a number of occasions? Overseas, people looking into the UK are scratching their head, not just the Germans, but the New York Times 2 weeks ago had a major feature on the UK, and the editorial started with the words, "How has it come to this?" So people are incredulous, really, as to the situation that we find ourselves in the UK. I think it's useful to remind ourselves of the trade situation that's the backdrop to all of this, that 54% of all UK imports are from the EU, and 46% of all of our exports are to the EU. EU 46%, USA 13.3%, China 5.7%, Switzerland 5.2%. That's the pecking order for our export market currently. There's going to be a lot of talk today about the Irish backstop, which has been the hurdle that stopped the ratification of the current withdrawal agreement. Ireland is in a situation where 67% of its exports to the EU go via the UK land bridge. That's 2/3 of all their exports to the EU go through the UK. So that's a serious issue for them. Whereas only 1.4% of their exports go into Northern Ireland. So the cross-border traffic there is actually pretty minimal in the context of things. We had a statement from the Office of Budget Responsibility, the OBR, last week that said a no-deal Brexit will spark a recession. We'll take a £30 billion economic hit. We should prepare for the cliff edge. So I'm hoping today that our colleagues here will be able to answer some of those questions. So, without more ado, can I ask and introduce you to David Jones, who's going to start. And the Right Honourable David Jones is a Conservative MP for Clwyd West and a former Brexit minister, has had first-hand experience of dealing with Brussels. David, good morning.
Thank you very much, Roger, and it's a great pleasure to be here today on such a beautiful day, both in terms of the weather and also in Yeah, sorry, we'll try again. It's a beautiful day, both in terms of the weather and also in terms of the Conservative Party. Of course, we now have a new leader as of yesterday, and a bit later on today, I trust the country will have a new Prime Minister. So this event could hardly be better timed. Brexit, of course, is the issue that has dominated both this Parliament and the previous Parliament. It has unfortunately proven the undoing of the current Prime Minister, Theresa May. It could, who knows, be the making of the new Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who has made his position extremely clear. His campaign was founded upon his belief that the negotiations hitherto for our departure from the European Union had not been really well crafted, that to seek to abandon the prospect of leaving the European Union without a negotiated agreement was folly, and that come what may, with or without an agreement, the United Kingdom is going to be leaving the European Union on the 31st of October, which is, I think, exactly 100 days from today. So the issues that no doubt we'll be discussing this morning are whether the withdrawal agreement that was negotiated between Theresa May and the European Union is still extant or extinct, whether there's any possibility of reviving it, and if so, will it be revived in its current form or will it be revived in a completely different form? And Roger mentioned the issue of the notorious Irish backstop. It was the Irish backstop that proved the undoing of Theresa May's withdrawal agreement. The Irish backstop, I'm sure you'll recall, was an arrangement which was promoted as an insurance policy, whereby if the United Kingdom wished to leave the arrangement set out in the withdrawal agreement, which actually comprehended the United Kingdom continuing to participate in the customs union and large elements of the single market, then effectively it would be required to leave Northern Ireland behind. This, of course, was inimical to the Democratic Unionist Party, the Northern Irish Party, which, of course, is the support of the current Conservative government, minority government. and to a large element of the Conservative Party itself, myself included, on the basis that it was something that was fatal to the Union of the United Kingdom, and therefore it was rejected. The interesting question will be whether indeed the European Union is prepared to reopen negotiations on the withdrawal agreement. So far they have said that they won't, but on the other hand, Boris Johnson has pronounced the withdrawal agreement as dead. So clearly we're in a situation of what happens when an irresistible force meets an immovable object. Clearly something is going to have to give. And I think in reality, there is no doubt that something is going to have to give, because it's clearly in the interests of both the United Kingdom and the European Union that there should be some form of negotiated agreement. Now, we can go into this in much more detail during this discussion, but I personally don't believe that the withdrawal agreement need to be the basis of the future arrangements between the UK and the European Union. I think it's quite possible to move towards ultimately a free trade agreement with a temporary arrangement put in place under the provisions of GATT 24 in the interim. This, of course, requires the goodwill of both sides, because GATT 24 is something that requires the agreement of both sides. And the question, I think, is going to move to the European Union as to whether it is going to recognize the reality of Boris Johnson anytime soon, recognize that Boris Johnson politically cannot accede to the withdrawal agreement, and decide to reopen negotiations on a different basis. That is going to be really exciting, and of course is going to mean a thrill-packed summer for all of us. But I think one way or another, one thing is clear. I think that we will have left the European Union by the 31st of October. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. Well, there you've heard it from a man, I think, who knows that we are going to be leaving. One question to leave for later, David, is that the changeover of the new personnel in the European Commission and Parliament doesn't happen until the 1st of November. So for the time being, the present team are all there, and many of them have probably got reasons why they don't particularly like Boris. So that's not going to make life easy. So that's a thought. So we now move to welcome the Right Honourable Tom Brake MP, who's the Brexit spokesman for the Liberal Democrats, and who also has a new leader who came out fighting yesterday. Tom.
Thank you very much, Roger and Dolfin, for today. What you're going to get today, I think, are some very, very polarized views. So I am just as passionate about the need for the United Kingdom to stay in the European Union as David is for us to come out. And I think that is one of the problems that we have, that the UK political scene has become, in the last 3 years, more polarized than it was 3 years ago, with people adopting more and more entrenched positions on the European Union issue. And that's why in the European elections, just a month or so ago, the Brexit Party, first of all, did very well, because they had a very clear position that they want to leave the European Union without any deal. And my party, the Liberal Democrats, did very well, because we said bollocks to Brexit and we want to stop Brexit. And the public are now falling into roughly these two categories. And so we have a highly polarized, highly divided country where you see generations pitted against each other, young people who voted overwhelmingly to stay in the European Union angry because their parents or their grandparents voted to leave, and vice versa. You have the southeast of the country, London, that voted to remain, which is perceived as being perhaps almost a separate territory to the north of England, which voted to leave. And you have perhaps a generation or a group of British citizens who are perhaps better educated and slightly wealthier, who are seen as being elitist and part of the establishment by the slightly less well-educated and slightly poorer section of the population, where the former voted to remain and the latter to leave. So we are now in a very, very difficult position. And I'm afraid, I think that the position that Boris Johnson has adopted, this idea of do or die by the 31st of October, is not one that the European Union is going to take very seriously, because they have from the outset held together a common position. And they needed to do that because there are 27 countries that have to agree in a position. And therefore, for Mr. Barnier or whoever it might be to agree to do something different requires him to go back to get authority from 27 countries to deviate from an agreed position. So it's fine for the UK to change its position. It's easy for the UK to do that, but actually it's a lot harder for the EU to do that. And that's why I think they have been consistent for the last 3 years. So I don't think there's any prospect that they are going to reopen the withdrawal agreement. There is a chance that the political declaration, so the future vision, that there might be some change to that, albeit that I think actually is probably not worth the paper it's written on in terms of the commitment that is made there. So these are the difficult issues that we're facing. And I mean, just to touch briefly on the Ireland issue. Now, I think people from outside, and indeed, unfortunately, some people from within government don't seem to understand why the border is as critical as it is. I went to South Armagh, a community in Northern Ireland a year or so ago, to talk to them. Now, that part of Northern Ireland had, during the troubles that we had in Northern Ireland, had 300 people murdered in that particular region. And what those people were saying to me is, look, we've experienced troubles. We know what it's like. We know what it's like to have a border presence here. And we know that if any sort of border presence is restored, because at the moment between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, there is not a border, you just drive across and you don't know that you have. But if you restore anything, and it doesn't have to be something on the border, it can be something at a distance from the border, which is one of the things that's perhaps being proposed as a solution, then what that says to the terrorists who are still there is that their vision of a united Ireland, for instance, has just taken a big step backwards, because now actually there's something on the border that wasn't there before. And that's why that is critical. And I'm afraid it was critical 3 years ago. And as far as I'm aware, no one has yet identified a solution to that. So there's that sort of security angle to it. But the other angle, of course, is that the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland is the border between the United Kingdom and the European Union. And from a European Union perspective, particularly in a no-deal scenario, the idea that, yes, the UK might be happy to have an open border, but the idea that the European Union would be happy to have an open border there, which meant that the UK could import goods from outside the EU, possibly to different standards, that would arrive in Northern Ireland and then would happily cross the border because it was an open border, get into the Republic of Ireland, and then be shipped from there somewhere else within the EU. The EU are not going to be very happy with that. So it's fine for us to say we don't want a border, but in practice, I suspect there will have to be a border. And the technological solutions that have been proposed, for instance, in the alternative arrangements document that Nicky Morgan and Greg Hands published last week, they don't actually exist. And even their document, they talk about this is something that we managed to do in 2 or 3 years' time, but actually there's no evidence that that's going to be possible in 2 or 3 years' time. So these are the difficulties that we face. I'm very pleased that we now have Jo Swinson as our leader, who has made her position just as clear as Vince Cable's was on these issues, that we're going to fight this to the death, because fundamentally we think, yes, there are problems with the UK being in the EU, but fundamentally we are better off in the European Union than we are out of it. And I'm very pleased that we now have, as a party, for the first time, a woman leader who is of a younger generation than Boris Johnson, Jeremy Corbyn and Ian Blackford for the SNP. And I think that puts us in a very good position for the very difficult period that this government and frankly the country are facing over the next few months.
Thank you very much, Tom. And as you can detect from that, the views are polarized. We were or are expecting Graham Stringer to attend. I'm assured he's on his way. He's representing the Labour Party, and as many of you will know, he is also a Brexiteer. I was wondering, actually, rather mischievously, whether there was going to be a change of leadership for the Labour Party today, which would complete the Holy Trinity, which a very interesting scenario. We'll go to Graham when he does arrive for his position and the party position, if indeed he knows what the party's position is, but we shall see. One of the questions I posed at the beginning was, are financial services prepared for a no-deal Brexit? I've finessed that slightly. I think the UK financial services sector is prepared for a Brexit. Whether it's a no-deal Brexit is questionable, but the many institutions in the city have already taken actions to open offices in European capitals, and they're not going to start repatriating those employees or closing those offices in the event that we didn't end up remaining after all. However, even after Brexit, whatever form Brexit takes, London will still be the world's largest financial centre, but probably smaller than it would otherwise have been if we'd remained in the EU. In the sector I know well of financial services and retail, the companies involved in that are worried about loss of financial passporting. We have £60 billion worth of earnings annually, of which 18 billion comes from the EU. We're worried in the insurance sector about contract continuity, particularly for insurance and derivatives contracts. In a no-deal scenario with the cliff edge, that is a serious issue for businesses to contend with. We've got big issues on data transfers and data adequacy agreements. That aspect of coming out of the EU can't be underestimated. So the larger businesses have definitely prepared for a Brexit, probably not a no-deal Brexit, but the smaller enterprises, UK manufacturing, the SMEs, probably haven't. They're loosely aware of it, and they really wouldn't know what was going to hit them on the 1st of November if indeed that was the first day that we were outside the EU. What we wanted to try and achieve today was some clarity in terms of investment decisions and the political situation. Now that we've got a new Prime Minister, we would hope there would be some more clarity. What I was slightly surprised at with the opening remarks is that we had intended to debate a no-deal Brexit on the one hand, or a negotiated deal on the other, and if it is a negotiated deal, does it bear a passing resemblance to the withdrawal agreement, but with modifications to accommodate the Irish backstop issue? But we've heard from Tom that there's a huge number of people out there who actually are ardent Remainers and would more or less insist that that option of staying is still on the table. Well, that introduces 3 dimensions to the issues. And I wonder if I could kick off with, if you'd like to both of you come up onto your perches in a friendly way. In the real world, and this is a very hard question, in the real world, is remaining still going to be an option, or have we gone too far down the road of leaving in some shape or form? Who would like to go first on that?
Well, shall I go first? I mean, obviously, for there to be the option of remain, a government has to agree to either revoke Article 50, which I think is very unlikely, or alternatively, to agree to there being a people's vote, where one of the options would be to remain. As I said, I think revoking Article 50 is very unlikely. However, there are circumstances in which I believe that even our present Prime Minister, although he has ruled that out as an option, may find that that is the only option that he is left with. And very briefly, why could that be the case? One, because Parliament have made it very clear that no deal is not acceptable. And Parliament have just made it very clear that the idea of proroguing Parliament, in other words, suspending Parliament to enable no deal to go through, is unacceptable. And the Speaker has said that he would find that unacceptable as well. Another way of proceeding might be to call a general election, but the difficulty for the present Prime Minister is that to call a general election before we have left the European Union, unless there is a deal with the Brexit Party, leaves the Conservative Party very vulnerable in that election, just as we have seen in the European elections. So if that is not an option, then the Prime Minister may feel that perhaps a slightly rebadged withdrawal agreement, which wouldn't probably command the majority of the House, but would or could command the majority of the House if he agreed to link the withdrawal agreement with a people's vote. Certainly my party, the Lib Dems, and a number of the other parties have said in those circumstances, if he is willing to put this to the public, with a greater degree of clarity than they had over 1,000 days ago about what Brexit actually meant, then we would help that through. So we would help that option to be put to the people in a vote. And if people voted for it, that's what they voted for, and we proceed with whatever Boris Johnson has managed to negotiate. But if in that vote people say, well, actually, with hindsight, now that we've perhaps got greater clarity about what our membership of the EU means and what the consequences of leaving it mean, we have voted to remain, then that is the decision they would have taken.
I think it would be catastrophic to democracy if we were to have a second referendum. It's very important that the people of this country, and indeed any other country for that matter, have faith that if they're asked to vote on a particular issue and they come up with an answer, the answer that they give should be the subject of delivery by the government. Now, it was made absolutely clear to the public prior to the referendum in 2016 that if the UK voted to leave the European Union, then we would leave the European Union. It was made repeatedly clear by the then Prime Minister David Cameron. It was also made very clear in the leaflet that every single household in the country had delivered through the post. That said specifically in terms, this is your decision, and whatever you choose, we will deliver. To go back and say, well, look, you clearly didn't understand what you were voting on. You were somehow ignorant. You were deluded. Come back and have another go at it. And by the way, if you get it wrong, then we might have another go again. That would be fatal to democracy in this country. The fact is that this country voted to leave. And we therefore, as politicians, I think politicians of all parties, have got a duty to deliver what they voted for. It's also suggested that it's somehow unclear what Brexit means, that we don't know what sort of Brexit it should be. Look at Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union. Article 50 sets out the basis for any member state to withdraw from the EU. And what that provides is that the departing member state should give notice of its wish to depart, that there should then be a period of up to 2 years in which the terms of the withdrawal agreement are agreed, if possible, and if not, then that country should leave at the end of 2 years. And it goes on to say that in those circumstances, the departing member state will cease to be subject to the European treaties. Now, ceasing to be subject to the European treaties means ceasing to be subject to the arrangements set up under the European treaties, which means essentially membership of the single market, membership of the customs union, and, I suggest most importantly, ceasing to be subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, which is essentially where the sovereignty of the European Union resides. That is very clear. And I think, therefore, if we can't achieve a withdrawal agreement, then under the terms of the treaty, we have to leave all those arrangements. And indeed, under the terms of what we voted for in 2016, we have to leave. This is an issue of political probity. This is an issue of the trust of the people in the institutions of this country. And I think, therefore, Roger, to have a second referendum would be absolutely catastrophic.
Can I just add one thing, which is that I would challenge David to say that he or any of the people on his side of the argument during the referendum campaign made it clear to people when they were voting in June 2016 that one of the options which Boris Johnson is now pursuing is the option of no deal. I would argue there was not a single person during that campaign who said Brexit means, it doesn't mean a fantastic deal, because that is what Boris Johnson and others were saying was going to be secured, and secured oh so easily. Actually, it means we're leaving without a deal at all. And I think the difficulty with this is there are very often people who journalists, for instance, who refer to no deal as if it was something, you know, in your business, you're going to make a deal. And you put the terms of your deal, and if you don't like what you're told in return, you can walk away. But you're walking away on exactly the same terms as you went into those negotiations. With no deal, that's not what we are doing. We are walking away with a very bad deal. So it's not a no change, it is a very substantial damaging change, which I don't think you or anyone else, as far as I can recall, said one of the most likely options was that we would leave the European Union without a deal. And don't say a managed no deal, because there's no such thing as a managed no deal. That is why, for instance, the government have spent £3 million on setting up a fast-track emergency medicines mechanism for getting medicines into the country in a no-deal scenario. That's what your government have done.
Well, just very briefly responding to that, I don't want to prolong this element of the debate, but all I would say is that I think I've got a bit more faith in the intelligence and good sense of the British electorate than Tom seems to have.
Well, I think it's we shouldn't be surprised, I suppose, those of us in the audience, that this issue of should we remain or should we leave is still a burning issue, as opposed to the detail of how we leave. I dug out the voting stats from 2016, and it's worth reminding ourselves that yes, 37% voted to leave and 35% voted to remain, but 28% of the electorate didn't bother to vote. And you can ask the question why they didn't. Did they think it was just advisory? It wasn't compulsory? Were they too young, not interested? It's a thought. On the final question then, on the point of us having another bite at this, is the only way that we could actually revisit the issue of remaining or leaving to have a general election on this issue?
I think a general election is probably inevitable sooner or later, but probably slightly later than sooner. I think if we were to have a general election this side of the 31st of October, it would be pretty fateful for a lot of parties, not least the Conservative Party. The European elections, to the extent that anything can be extrapolated from them, shows that a lot of voters did depart from the Conservative Party and supported the Brexit Party, which you'll recall was formed only about 6 to 8 weeks before that election. So by any standards, it was a remarkable result for that party. The Brexit Party, and I'm being absolutely frank with you here, is breathing down the necks of the Conservative Party. And for so long as the Conservative Party has failed to deliver Brexit, then it will remain a threat. Boris Johnson understands this, and I think that every Conservative MP understands this. And I think a lot of Labour MPs understand this too, because the Brexit Party impacted not only on the Conservative Party, but also on a large number of Labour seats. There are Labour MPs all over the country who would be extremely concerned at the prospect of an early general election. Now, bear in mind that in this country, we now have the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which provides that parliaments must run for 5 years, unless one of two things happen. One, there's a supermajority in favour of an early election, which I would suggest is unlikely. And two, there is a vote of no confidence in the government, a successful vote of no confidence in the government, and a new government is not formed within 14 days. I would think, again, that a lot of Labour MPs would be very reluctant in a no confidence motion to force that general election upon the country and see a lot of their seats being wiped out. So I think that the most likely scenario, and I could be completely wrong, is that we get Brexit out of the way on the 31st of October, that Boris takes some time to continue to build a rapport with the British people, and also give sufficient time for the Brexit party's impetus to dwindle and disappear altogether. In those circumstances, it would be hoped that a lot of the Brexit voters, who I think primarily were Conservatives, will come back to the fold, particularly, of course, if Brexit has been delivered. And then Boris will be in a good position to win the general election. And my most likely, I think the most likely outcome, I wouldn't put any money on it though, is a general election in the spring of next year.
Well, first of all, something that worries me about what David said is that a lot of the motivation behind this seems to be the effect that the Brexit party would have on the Conservative Party. What I'm worried about is the effect of leaving the European Union on the United Kingdom, which I think is a much more significant issue. In terms of a general election, I think in reality, the reason that we're calling for a people's vote is because the only way, in my view, that the country can change direction, having had a referendum on the subject of the European Union, or our membership of, is by way of a referendum. Because we know that when Theresa May called the general election in 2017, the purpose of that general election, as she set out, was to give her a majority, a bigger majority, to deliver Brexit. But of course, what happened during the course of that general election campaign is that, perhaps understandably, it became about a whole host of other issues, such as, for instance, her unwillingness to take part in public debates. And in the latter stage of the campaign, it became about the so-called dementia tax. So the idea that you could have a general election on one issue and one issue alone, I don't think that is possible. And that's why David is trying to portray me as being anti-democratic by putting forward the idea of a people's vote, but actually a vote in which everyone in the country takes part. For me, that sounds quite democratic, and it would be about confirming whether, frankly, the debacle of the last 3 years and whatever has come out of that eventually is something that the public, more than 3 years on, feel is an adequate representation of their view of Brexit or not. And if it isn't, then they should have the choice to say, we don't want any of it.
So really what we have a common accord between the two of you, that we should expect a general election, probably in the spring rather than in the autumn, but that we should factor that into our investment planning for the UK, is certainly in the next 6-9 months.
I'd actually say I wouldn't put any money on it, and I'm not suggesting anyone in this room should put their money on it either. but it is a factor, yeah, in which Simon's listening to here very attentively.
We're planning on one before the end of October. So
yes.
I think you may think about your investment plans in terms of
yeah.
general election.
And I know that some Conservative associations are similarly on a sort of semi-war footing, David.
Just on that last point, I mean, I personally, as a Brexiteer, would certainly welcome a general election in October, because it would make the likelihood of our departing on the 31st of October all the stronger. Because, of course, it would remove any time for further negotiations before then. So I bring it on, but I think it's very unlikely.
Except the EU will give us an extension if we're in the middle of a general election campaign. So bad luck. David.
Yes, but only if we ask for one.
Well, that's clear then. Good. Okay, so we can take away from this the likelihood of a general election. There is a huge debate still on whether we remain or whether we leave. If we could put that on one side, because today is to try and answer people's questions on planning for the future, financial investments. If we accept that leaving is going to happen sooner or later, then what sort of leaving should we have? We've got the no-deal Brexit cliff edge, which I think even you, David, would agree is the least desirable outcome, to have a no-deal Brexit. If, on the other hand, it's capable of negotiating an agreement that's satisfactory to us. And that agreement, which we've hitherto referred to as the withdrawal agreement, what, in your opinions, would require to be done to that and be accepted by EU, or more particularly by Ireland, for Boris to be able to sell that to Parliament?
I think that the difficulty is that within the Conservative Party, to say nothing of the House of Commons as a whole, there's a whole variety of opinions as to what would be acceptable. I think it's fair to say that the minimum acceptable agreement would be one that saw the Irish backstop removed. I think it was a huge pity that the current Prime Minister actually signed up to that, because it resulted in the withdrawal agreement being rejected on 3 occasions. On one occasion by the biggest parliamentary majority ever against a sitting government. So I think at the very least the Irish backstop has to go. But there are other elements of the withdrawal agreement that I think are, certainly from my perspective, unacceptable. I think most importantly is Article 4 of the withdrawal agreement, which provides effectively that the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice will continue to be supreme in a large number of areas. If you think about this, you can understand why people who do believe in British independence regard that as impossible to accept. What effectively you're doing is saying that that a foreign court should be the supreme legal arbiter in this country. Now that's something that is almost unprecedented in any jurisdiction throughout the world. There are cases where it does prevail, for example, in Ukraine, where it's a potential accession arrangement, but of course Ukraine is actually wanting to join the European Union, as opposed, as in our case, trying to leave. The only example that I could actually find, believe it or not, was in Montenegro, whereas part of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese courts actually do have jurisdiction in Montenegro for certain purposes related to infrastructure, and can in fact make orders for the confiscation of Montenegrin property. Now, I'm not entirely sure that this country, which is one of the oldest democracies in the world, which is an important member of most of the councils of the world, including being a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations, should be in a position where a foreign court has supreme legal authority. So I think that Article 4 is going to have to be revisited. And the problem that you've got is when you start removing these elements of the withdrawal agreement, what effectively you're doing is, it's a bit like a sweater where you start pulling at a piece of wool, and of course the whole thing ultimately starts to fall to bits. And I actually think that the only way forward is to completely revisit the whole process and look at a different sort of arrangement, which I think should be moving towards ultimately a free trade agreement with the European Union, which could be the subject of a temporary agreement in the interim, which can be done, but will require swift negotiation on the part of both parties, and most importantly, will require the European Union to come to terms with the fact that the withdrawal agreement is dead.
Well, first of all, just on the backstop, of course, as David highlighted, that is something that the UK government was party to negotiating, which I know he regrets, but that was what was needed, or that is what could be delivered within the red lines that our Prime Minister had set. Just in terms of would we prefer no deal or a different deal? Clearly, as a party, we would prefer there to be a deal. And a deal that leaves us as close to the European Union as possible, which is probably a single market and customs union, something which I know is anathema to the government. And I suppose because if we do leave, then longer term as a party, we will want to consider whether we want to campaign to rejoin the European Union. And clearly, if we have left on a basis that leaves that relationship fairly close, that would be easier. Although I've said we would want to consider it, because I, as the party's spokesman, would want to have some real clarity about what the implications would be for the United Kingdom were we to do that. And it might be that the European Union sought to extract such a payment from us or an arrangement that was not acceptable. So I'm certainly not saying as a party that is something that we would automatically do. We want to see what was available, but clearly the closer we end up with the European Union, the more likely it is at some point in the future, if the terms of rejoining were not onerous, it would facilitate that process.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question of our panel. Can you, all of you in the room, start thinking of the questions you'd like to put to them? And when you do ask the question, if you'd identify yourself and maybe say whether you actually had a vote in the referendum or not. You don't have to say which way you voted, but I'd be interested to know whether you did participate in that referendum 3 years ago. The other elephant in the room, gentlemen, of course, is the constitutional aspect here. Were we to particularly have a no-deal Brexit, but even with a negotiated deal, we've got big issues with Scotland, who voted to remain. We've also still got the issue with Northern Ireland, which voted to remain. To what extent should, in our deliberations, our negotiations, we factor in with care managing the realistic expectations of the Scots so that we avoid, heaven forbid, a barbed wire fence along Hadrian's Wall, for example, to keep the Scots out? That sort of basic issue, or leading maybe to unification of Ireland. If sufficient people in the north say enough is enough, and that solves the problem, of course, of that particular border. So we're walking on eggshells with these issues, but I feel that you as politicians need to take that into full account when you're advising your colleagues in the negotiating process. Who would like to go first on that?
Well, I think you've put your finger on it. There is a real risk that Boris Johnson becomes the last Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, frankly, because the best selling point possible that the SNP have in Scotland for pushing for independence is Scotland having voted to remain, and the government, the Westminster government, pushing through particularly a no-deal Brexit. So that is a real risk. Now, and what's interesting, of course, is talking to the SNP, it doesn't seem as though all of the issues that I'm flagging up as difficulties once the UK leaves the EU in terms of cross-border trade, paperwork, and so on, that there's an acceptance that actually that might be the implication of Scotland leaving the United Kingdom. So, but there is a real risk. And again, as you've highlighted, there is a real risk given that it is something that is permitted in terms of a referendum in Northern Ireland, that perhaps reunification of Ireland might be another outcome of this. But it's very difficult to see how the government can address those concerns, because the position of the SNP is very clear. They want to stop Brexit, and that clearly is not something the government can deliver. So we are really at the risk of breaking up the United Kingdom.
Yes, Roger, by the way, you didn't mention Wales, which is where I come from. And of course, Wales voted very positively to leave the European Union, I'm glad to say.
Forgotten about Wales, don't worry.
But you've identified an important issue. I think we need to remember a few things. It was made absolutely clear that this was a UK-wide referendum. And obviously, separate parts of the UK, not only Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, but also areas within England voted differently from other parts of the country, including, of course, particularly London. But I think that what we see now is an issue of starting a healing process. I think that politicians have got to recognize that there was a vote, a UK-wide vote, which came up with a clear outcome. So far as Northern Ireland is concerned, of course, I don't think that much has changed, because the Belfast Agreement remains in place, and under the Belfast Agreement, Northern Ireland remains part of the United Kingdom only for so long as the majority of its people wish it to be. I don't think that anything changes as a consequence of that. So far as Scotland is concerned, I think that the problem that we've got there, and I'll say this in all frankness, is that we've got a a Scottish government, which of course is SNP, which essentially feeds on negativity. Any bad news that emanates from Westminster is something that they will feed upon with great alacrity. However, I think it's clear that we will be leaving the European Union. Scotland, with the rest of the UK, will leave. If the SNP wish to have a further referendum, then they're going to have to spell out to the people of Scotland what that means in practical terms. Are they going to apply for readmission to the European Union, which of course would take some time? In which case, do they want to see the sort of border difficulties that we have in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland reproduced on speed in Scotland and England? Because England is by far the biggest export market for Scotland and Scottish goods. And I think that there would be grave concern in Scotland, and the Scots are, if nothing else, a pragmatic people. There would be great concern if they saw any greater difficulty in accessing their most important market. All this, of course, does require sensitivity. And I think that it's really important that post-Brexit, the Westminster government should make it its absolute priority to try to spread prosperity throughout the whole of the United Kingdom. I know that I'm speaking to a London audience here, but you know, frankly, from the perspective of the rest of the UK, it is perceived that London does get by far the lion's share of the cake in terms of national prosperity. Boris, I know, does want to spread that out. He was speaking about it only yesterday in the 1922 committee. And I think it's really important that this government delivers upon that. And that is a process that will not be done overnight. It will take some years, but nevertheless, with sufficient will, I think it can be achieved.
David didn't quite answer the question in that I think what he has just said, paraphrased in effect, that he accepts there's a real possibility that Scotland will leave the United Kingdom. Although, of course, it requires the Westminster government to agree for them to have another referendum at present. Because, of course, the SNP are driven as much by their desire to secure independence, regardless of the economic consequences, as the Brexiters are driven by the desire to leave the European Union, regardless of the economic consequences.
With respect, I did say that the SNP feeds on negativity. And I think that that's why it's really important that the Westminster government should ensure that the interests of Scotland and indeed every other part of the country are fully reflected post-Brexit.
Okay, thank you. So who would like the first? You, sir, with the yellow shirt, you had your hand up first. There's a mic coming, I think. And if you would give your name and whether you had a vote in the referendum, it would be interesting.
My name is Tagir Ismailov, and as usual, how it is said, from Russia with love or from Russia with disruption, let's say. I don't yet have right to vote here. Of course, I have my own opinion because I am a little bit old. I am a little bit old and know a little bit more than maybe you refer to young people. First of all, what is a pity here? Both gentlemen refer to democracy, but they are not telling the truth. And the point is, everywhere, what is the end game of European Union? Could you tell me?
Yes, of course. The end game of the European Union is to create a country called Europe.
No.
Yes, it is.
No, United States of Europe. But it's not the country. Do you know what? No. When the idea came to life, do you know about European Union?
Yes, it started before the war.
Before World War I. It started in 1849 or something like this one. But in 1915, famous guy, Lenin, published an article there he clearly stated, yes, United States of America, it was good idea and it was based on non-national states, yeah, taxes and so on. What happened in European Union idea? It is based on national states like Greece, UK, and so on. And at the end, he write it down, black and white. It is impossible because the difference of national interests. Now, the world is changing. We now have so-called New World Order. It's changing the principle of states. And at the end, maybe many states will arrange about 9, let's say, currency unions.
Sir, could you get to your question, sir?
Yeah, I will put my question.
Thank you.
So you have to understand the roots, let's say. So the whole question of in 17 was put wrongly. It was not explained in the game of the European Union. It's crippling jurisdiction. It is started with the union of coal and steel and going on. And you are wrong that in democracy it is not possible second referendum. Don't forget about Danish and Irish second referendum just recently. But my question is simple. Do you know what finance minister of Germany told in 2017? He told, as soon as we finish with Brexit, it was in writing, we will get that all the countries in European Union would be in euro. So next step would be not only losing the legal independence, the currency will go out. There won't be any pound. Yes.
Okay. We'll take that.
This is the thinking for financial guy here. You know. So this is a task, and European Union or United States of Europe only may survive like common currency, common taxes, common military, common everything else, and so on. So today, it's still possibility to stay out. But the question is, what consequences you think for UK remaining? You are talking what
Could you finish the question, sir?
The question is what
you haven't asked the question.
I'm asking question.
No, you're actually making a series of statements, and I think we can conclude from that is the question is to do with, is there a future for the United States, Europe, and what is the future for the European currency?
No, not, I believe in my opinion, well, I can't vote.
Sorry,
the future of UK is independent.
Sorry, sir, we are limited on time. Thank you very much. Tom,
okay, well, first of all, I don't accept your description of the future plans for the European Union. Even as someone who is a very strong pro-European Europhile, I would not support the idea of a United States of Europe. And frankly, the idea that the French, the Spaniards, the Italians would happily go along with a United States of Europe where they were corralled, presumably by the Germans, into adopting a unique position across the board, I think is not going to happen. But what I do agree with you, and I think this is a perfectly legitimate point, is that whilst I can describe, and in fact the Office for Budget Responsibility, Philip Hammond, our ex-Chancellor, can describe what the consequences of leaving the EU are, particularly with no deal, it's much harder for me to describe what the consequences of us staying in the European Union are, because yes, I accept that beyond perhaps the next couple of years, I can't give you clarity about where in the future an EU, which presumably for the next few years is Macron is going to be the main player in it when Merkel's successor starts to learn the ropes. I can't predict where that'll go exactly. That's true.
I think that there is a thrust within the European Union towards federalism. I think there's no doubt at all about that. If you have a look at the appointment of the new President of the European Commission, Mrs. von der Leyen, you've got somebody who is an avowed federalist and who wants to see much closer integration between the various countries of Europe. I think you're right, actually, though. The important issue is that of the currency. Is the currency that will be the cement of any federalist European Union. I think in order to achieve that, there's got to be a lot more political integration and there's got to be fiscal integration. I think that that is the direction of travel within the EU. And if you actually have a look at what the EU has done over, well, since the period since the Treaty of Lisbon, you've actually got presidents, 5 presidents, but you know, there they are, the presidents. We've got a president who gives an annual State of the Union address. You've got a flag, you've got a common currency, you've got an anthem. They're sending ambassadors around the world. And of course, the latest development is the creation of a European army. That, of course, is a matter for the EU. If that's what they want to do, then that's their decision. It's not a matter for the UK, of course, because we'll have left.
Next question, the lady, microphone, please, Andrew, there.
Hello, good afternoon, good morning. My name is Alexandra Kenna. I'm based in London, and I have a question regarding the freedom of movement after Brexit. What do you think will happen? And the reason I'm asking this question is, although I'm based in London, I work for a Cypriot law firm, and we help high net worth individuals with Cypriot citizenship. So we're already getting many inquiries from British nationals, high net worth individuals who do not have an Irish granny or granddad, and who have 2 million euros to invest for 5 years to obtain Cypriot citizenship. Those who are looking, according to our colleagues from other firms and sources, there other Cypriot and Maltese law firms already receiving applications for processing applications from British high net worth individuals for Cypriot citizenship. Also, we see the tendency amongst our clients, those who previously would have got the British passport, now they're turning to Cypriot and other European Union solutions for citizenship, and talking to tax advisors in UK when they saw the tendency 1.5 years ago, people were coming into, high net worth individuals wanted to come into UK. Now it's the opposite, unfortunately. People looking for solutions outside UK. What do you think is going to happen after Brexit in terms of freedom of movement? And unfortunately, I did not vote in the referendum. I was not available that day. Had I known the implications, I would have definitely voted to stay.
So for you, Brexit is a good thing because at least you're making a lot of money out of it. But sorry, I said, so for you, Brexit is a good thing because it's good for your business. I think this is an important issue which has got to be addressed immediately. One of the things that Boris Johnson said immediately, twice yesterday, once in the 1922 committee, is that unilaterally the UK will give continued rights of residence to those EU citizens who are currently in this country, which I think is the right thing to do because people came here on the basis of an expectation under the terms of the rules of the European Union that they would be allowed to remain in this country. Similarly, however, of course, bilaterally, other EU member states are making arrangements for continued freedom of movement and residence rights for British nationals. The Spanish government, for example, has passed legislation fairly recently to allow continued rights for British nationals to continue to reside in Spain, to access Spanish services and so on. If we don't get a withdrawal agreement, then these arrangements will have to be made bilaterally. Knowing Boris Johnson as I do, my suspicion is that he will have a very liberal immigration policy, which will contrast markedly, I think, with that of Theresa May, who, of course, was not a liberal in terms of inward migration. The fact is that we will have control of our own borders again. And the way that we control the borders is a matter for the government of the day. I think under the new Prime Minister, we will see a liberal environment. I would hope that other EU member states will reciprocate. I mean, many of them, of course, benefit enormously from British nationals coming into their countries, Spain most particularly. And that is why they were so keen so quickly to ensure that British nationals continue to have those rights. But clearly there will be changes. There have got to be changes because we're leaving the European Union.
Well, of course, what has happened since the vote 3 years ago is that we have seen immigration from the EU fall. At the same time, it's increased from outside the European Union. And I'm not sure that the liberal immigration policy that David has just referred to, that Boris Johnson might be about to deploy, is, for instance, what the Brexit Party will expect to happen. So if he does adopt quite a generous immigration policy, it is quite possible that the Conservatives' desire that the Brexit Party withers away won't happen, because they'll be attacking the government on the basis of a liberal immigration policy, which I would support. And I mean, the government are, I think, starting to, the penny is dropping, that even things like the £30,000 threshold that is set for people coming in from the EU is one that is very problematic in a number of sectors, including sectors where we want to see people coming in. And I'll give you one very good example. The Institute for Cancer Research, which is just outside my constituency in Sutton, relies very heavily on people who are perhaps the best in their field in terms of cancer research, but very often they are at the beginning of their career and therefore would not pass the £30,000 threshold. So the government are going to have to make lots of minor adjustments in lots of different fields to reflect the fact that when we had an immigration policy that allowed any EU citizen to come here, on the whole, they were coming here to fill roles that were required. They're now going to have a less flexible policy, which puts more burden on employers, but actually will probably end up with roughly the same number of people coming, fulfilling roughly the same roles as they would have done had we remained part of the European Union with freedom of movement. And I'm afraid, on that point, I've got to get back to Westminster.
Whoops. I'm sorry, I hadn't really... That's Tom, thank you very much. I'm sorry that you have to dash off, but I realize that. Are you okay for a few more minutes? Yep. Thank you. He's just had a message to return. So the lady is going to ask a question here. And can I take the question together with the gentleman at the back? So the lady first here in the second row. And David will do his best to be impartial.
No, I won't.
Thank you, gentlemen. Good morning. I'll be very brief here. So I am the head of China Business Group at Blake Rothenberg, a London accountancy firm, primarily specialized at helping international business set up in the UK, but also equally UK private individuals and private businesses to thrive in the world. So I did participate in the referendum vote, and I am happy to say that I voted to remain. All the directions of politics in the world seem to go the opposite direction that I personally want, but that's fine. My question today is, has the government, apart from planning for a very difficult Brexit, could be a no-deal Brexit, have we thought about the future and beyond? So let's say Brexit does happen, which I believe 80% that's going to. With the multipolarized world, with China and the US have a bit of power struggle, I can see that the UK has tried to remain as neutral as possible in all of these, but has the government formed some sort of thought? I know that Commonwealth will be the immediate friends that we go to, but let's say if US doesn't want the UK to follow China as much, what would be our reaction? I'm really interested. Thank you.
Okay, and the gentleman at the back, please. I don't know whether it's a linked question, but we'll see.
Good morning, thank you. My question,
Your name?
yeah, Daniel Olatsmanovic. I come from Montenegro, by the way. Some new stuff I learned today about our country. My firm actually invests in regions in real estate, so affordable housing, hotels, etc. So everything that is supported by mass demand from average population and lower income. My question is: we talk a lot about Brexit and when we will sort it out this way or other way. However, at the same time, business and economy has to, live forward. My question would be: what are the current initiatives that you're aware of that would spark the boost, economical boost? Because we understand that even if we make a decision that we stay, or we make a decision that we leave, we still find it that it will still bring on the vulnerability for the business because the new rules will not yet be clear so fast. So what do you see as initiatives in which one or two in different sectors that you believe might allow Britain economy to pick up on the economic growth? Thank you.
I deal with the first question, first of all. I think that the United Kingdom has made it very clear that post-Brexit it looks to be as global a nation as possible. Traditionally, of course, we always have been a world trading nation, and some of the older members of the audience may possibly remember that the reason that we didn't join the old common market as quickly as we might was because we were vetoed by Charles de Gaulle. And Charles de Gaulle actually famously said, if the United Kingdom wishes to choose between Europe and the open sea, it will always choose the open sea. So it could be said that we are reverting to what we've traditionally always done. I think that we have got to be a free trading country. And I think that we must try to seek as many free trade agreements as we possibly can, not just with the European Union, but with other countries right across the world. President Trump has made it very clear that he wants to try to agree a very swift free trade agreement with the United Kingdom. I mean, that of course in itself would be the most enormous opportunity for the UK because it's easily the world's biggest, well, I could say easily the world's biggest market is being caught up by China. And that of course is the other limb of your question. I think that once we've left the European Union, we will be making decisions about which trading partners we wish to seek. I think at the moment it's very clear that we want to seek as many new free trading partners as we possibly can. I can't foresee, of course, what will be the future relationship between China and the United States, or come to that, what will be the position of the Trans-Pacific Partnership or whatever. There are all these arrangements prevailing around the world. I just think that the UK should be in a position to seek out the markets that suit it best. I think that it can do that as an independent country far more quickly than when it has to negotiate as one of 28 countries, which inevitably slows up the process. And I'll give you an example. This is a true story. When I was a Brexit minister, I was in Luxembourg trying to agree the ratification of the Sita, the Canadian deal that the EU had negotiated, but which still required the ratification of individual member states. And I remember sitting in this enormous conference room, drinking copious cups of coffee for several hours, while the Belgian foreign minister waited to hear from the Wallonian prime minister as to whether Wallonia would actually ratify the deal. And bear in mind that this had been 7 years in negotiation, and a region of Belgium was threatening to hold the whole process up. And in the end, I and my other colleagues decided to go back because there was no sign of a breakthrough from Brussels. And as I walked out of the room, I heard one of my colleagues say to another, "Where exactly is Wallonia?" And this was the problem. And this is the problem that the EU will always have in forging free trade agreements. It will only proceed as fast as the slowest member. That is something that we'll be able to avoid once we're outside the EU. In terms of initiative, well, I think you're going to have to wait a bit because, of course, we've now got a new prime minister and he will be making his policies a lot clearer. He's made it very clear that he wants to spend the next 3 months communicating very vocally the arrangements that are being made for our departure from the EU, which will inevitably include what arrangements he wants to make to stimulate the British economy post-Brexit. I remember that the only time that Philip Hammond caused a stir on the other side of the English Channel was when, shortly after the Brexit vote, he made it clear that the United Kingdom had its own economic levers it could pull if necessary, and that the EU might not be entirely happy to have a new Singapore sitting just off its shores. And that caused the most enormous consternation in Brussels. So we do have levers we can pull. I believe we should be a very buccaneering economy post-Brexit. But I think you're going to have to wait until the Prime Minister's got his feet under the table for a bit and announces what he's going to be doing.
We've got time for just a couple more questions before we wrap up. Yes.
Hello, Vicky Price from the Centre for Economics and Business Research, and I voted Remain. I was very interesting what you said, David, that Jones, that Boris Johnson needs to get Brexit out of the way. But in reality, even though you're right, it takes ages for an EU treaty to take place, we have just signed a number, or the EU has, with South Korea, Canada, you mentioned already, Mercosur, of course, which is there as well, Japan. So we basically already have more or less free trade agreements with quite a large part of the world. And the US one, we have objected to a number of things already from the UK side. And we don't have one with India because we objected to, that's the UK, to giving free visas for all the students, all people who want to come here. So we are partly to blame for the fact that it's been a bit slow at times, and we have to acknowledge that. But yes, you're quite right, we can do things faster. But the reality is that even if we leave, either with or without a deal, that for businesses, there are going to be 2, 3, possibly longer years of negotiation. So therefore, no real certainty at the end. Really goes back to the question that was just been asked. So it's not going to be over by any means. And that uncertainty, and the reason why Boris Johnson and his new Chancellor are going to have to do something for the economy, and is because of the signs of a slowdown, because the economy will react badly to whatever deal is reached, because basically investment has been happening. So can you just, thinking ahead for businesses, and FTAs, the ones we've signed and the ones that we may be signing, and the withdrawal agreement and the political agreement around it, a declaration, don't really cover financial services or services more generally. And this is probably a room full of service and financial service people. So it will definitely leave us in a weaker position, even though we're still going to be significant. So it's not going to be over. So can you just take us through, because all the businesses that we all advise, how to survive that period? And do we just believe in optimism or Boris Johnson, or is there going to be something concrete?
Dave. Yes, please do. Yeah.
If I could come straight back on that one, you're absolutely right. The issue is, what will be the form of the relationship with the EU post-Brexit? Now, I suggested a few moments ago that a sensible way forward might be for the UK to propose to the EU that we proceed towards a free trade agreement, which would probably take, if Sita is a precedent, 7 years, probably less actually, because we have a huge degree of alignment between our regulations and theirs. And that in moving towards that, we utilize GATT 24 with a view to putting in place an interim arrangement, which should enable us to maintain many of the elements of the single market and customs union post-Brexit. That does require goodwill on the part of the European Union. And the question is going to be whether the European Union is going to behave commercially or whether it's going to behave politically. And that is something that I can't obviously entirely foresee. My concern, however, is that given the complexion of the new commission, which, as I say, is going to be headed up by an avowed federalist, there may be a temptation, so far as the EU is concerned, to make an example of the UK to discourage others from ever having the temerity of trying to leave. That could happen. However, it could also be the case that they take into account that for example, Germany is exporting about 1 million cars or so to this country every year, and a 10% tariff on every manufactured car would be pretty catastrophic for the German motor industry. They could actually start thinking in commercial terms, recognizing that recognizing that we will be one of their top export markets, and agreeing to put in place the temporary arrangements under GATT 24 that would enable us to continue. So far as the financial services industry is concerned, the impression I get from dealing with the industry, as I did when I was at DexU, is that the City of London is already putting in place measures to guard against the disruption of Brexit. Now, that is not going to be completely satisfactory. I think the larger companies, as Roger said, have already put in place those measures. It may well be the smaller and medium-sized businesses that will have a bit more disruption. Of course, the fact is that the single market in financial services isn't complete anyway. But, you know, I get back to Philip Hammond's point about creating a dynamic buccaneering economy off the coast of Europe. The City of London, as Roger says, is by far the largest financial centre in the EU. The second largest is Luxembourg, which, you know, I've visited, but it frankly doesn't hold a candle to the City of London, which is an unrivaled, unique ecosystem. I think that it will survive, but I say quite frequently, quite openly, as I say frequently, and as I said a few moments ago, we must expect disruption, and the duty that this government has got to do is to ensure that it communicates over the next 3 months what arrangements it's putting in place to guard against that and to minimize it.
I think, thank you very much indeed, David. I think, mindful of the time, we'll have to draw a line on this occasion. Today is an historic day. The Queen is this afternoon going to be, we assume, having an audience with what will be her 14th Prime Minister in her reign, which by a process of arithmetic means that poor Theresa May was actually the 13th Prime Minister, which might account for the travails that she's had in the last 3 years. I think we can conclude from the discussions that we've had today, even though we haven't had input from Labour, is that there's actually still a number of huge issues that have not been resolved, even down to the basic one of do we remain or do we leave? The Lib Dems position is no Brexit, period. Those of us in the financial sector actually do crave certainty and want to, and are planning for a Brexit. We would hope that it's a negotiated Brexit that everybody can sign up to, because that would be less disruptive than the cliff edge of a no deal. We wish, I'm sure all of us wish the new Prime Minister well in his deliberations, regardless of our politics. Whether he can actually achieve anything with the European bureaucrats that are there at the moment of the old guard before the new guard comes in is open to question. And whether Leo Varadkar and the Irish government are going to be able to assist in reaching an accommodation on the Irish backstop, which would be a big win if we can achieve that. So thank you, all of you, for being here today. London is still a great place to do business and will still be a great place to do business regardless of Brexit or not. We've got European weather, so Europe doesn't want to let us go today in the next few days. So thank you for giving up your mornings and joining us for the Dolfin breakfast. Enjoy the rest of your day and the few months and years ahead. Thank you.